Hello, welcome to our study of Bible battles. God's Word is full of war, of battle. And it's this illustration that's used for us so often about God versus Satan and how we are in a battle, a war against Satan and against our own lusts, and how we must win that battle. And so we're going to go and look at some of the actual battles that happen in the Bible, and we're going to see some lessons that we can learn about it. And I really want to pique your interest into looking at the history behind these things, because there's a lot of details that the Bible doesn't give us, because the Bible isn't written to satisfy every curiosity that we have. But looking at what the Bible says alongside some geographical and historical information really makes these stories come to life and pinpoint some very important truths that we need to understand and know. And so let's begin our study with the slaughter of the kings. This is the only battle that I know of that is referred to in the New Testament. There may be others that I just have slipped my mind, but this particular battle, which is the first battle that we have recorded for us in God's Word, is talked about in the New Testament because of this man named Melchizedek. And a lot of times if you've studied this in Bible class already, the actual battle part is covered a little bit, but mostly skipped over to get to this point, because it's the point that's mentioned in the New Testament. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And it goes on to describe Melchizedek, and especially comparing him in a type form to Jesus. A very important figure for us to study. But we're going to go back and look at all the events that lead up to this, because there's so many interesting things there that we might otherwise just skip. So let's dig into the slaughter of the kings. Before we do that, we need to have just a little bit of an understanding of basic Bible geography, because wars happen on ground. And we need to know where that ground is and where the different forces are coming from. And so anytime we think about geography, we start with bodies of water, because generally they don't change that much. The Mediterranean Sea today is where it always has been. Nations rise and fall and move and expand and shrink. But bodies of water are sort of the benchmarks that we look at when we're talking about geography. And so let's look at the seas. You have the Mediterranean Sea, middle of the Earth Sea, literally. You have the Persian Gulf, right above that, and you have Iraq, and to the east of that you have Iran, important areas to our understanding today. We also have the Red Sea, the one with the bunny ears down there, or the peace sign. And then we have the Dead Salt Sea. I'm including this one even though it's a very small sea right there, because it's very important to our study today. Let's look at the rivers. All right, so you have the Tigris River coming up from the Persian Gulf, along with the Euphrates River. And that system of rivers there create the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, and a very important area, very fertile area. And then we move further west. We have the Nile River in Egypt. Not going to be important to our study today, but it will be down the line. And then we have the Jordan River. The Jordan River, of course, running from the Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee. It's where Jesus was baptized, the main river that flows through Israel. And then let's think about some of the nations that come up. This isn't that important for our study today, but it will be down the line. You have Persia, modern-day Iran. You have Babylon, modern-day Iraq. Assyria, up there northern in the Fertile Crescent, and the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And then we have Egypt, and they're going to be a world power throughout the time of the Old Testament. And then we have the nation of Israel. Of course, in our study today, Israel isn't there yet. In fact, Israel, Jacob, isn't even born. All right, but Abraham is living in that area, and he comes into play in this battle. All right, let's get into it. The slaughter of the kings. You have three basic alliances that are formed. And we're going to look at these alliances as we go forward. But I've named these. The Bible doesn't name them these. But these are a collection of nations and people in Abram's case that come together to fight against each other. You have the Eastern Alliance all the way over there in Mesopotamia, and the Western Alliance at the south end of the Dead Sea. And then after they fight twice, Abram's alliance comes into play. Now, let's begin. In verses 1 and 2 of Genesis 14, it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. Now, let's look at where these folks come from, because we don't know where Elam and Shinar and all these places are, just off the top of our heads generally. But let's look at it. Elam is the easternmost nation in this alliance, and Kedorlaomer seems to be the most powerful of them, and that comes into play as we look further on in the chapter. You have Arioch, king of Elasar. We don't know exactly where this place was. Many think that it was the southern end right there near the Persian Gulf. Some people put it up higher in the Fertile Crescent. The king of Shinar, Amraphel, he's the first one listed in Genesis. And then Tidal, king of nations. We don't know exactly who this guy was. It seems that he ruled over these nomadic tribes of people that moved around. So we don't know exactly where he was from, but it's generally thought that he's somewhere over there with the rest of them. Now, the Western Alliance. These nations, these city-states, Sodom wasn't a nation, it was a city, but at this time, that's what a nation was, just one city that had its walls and had its king. And so Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and king of Bela, Zoar. Now, what happens? All these were joined together in the Vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea. 2 years they served Kedorlaomer. And so this battle happens here at the outset, this initial war where the Eastern Alliance comes over and fights against this Western Alliance in the Valley of Siddim. Now, Siddim is most likely in the south part of the Dead Sea, extending down toward the eastern bunny ear of the Red Sea. And a lot of times, and most of the time at this time, they would fight their wars in valleys. And the reason for that was that they wanted a big flat area that they could line up against each other and smash into each other. All right, so they weren't hiding out. They would put their forces out in the middle, and they would go head to head, and they would group together and fight against groups until they smashed through the other opponent's lines, and then they would take care of business. All right, so the Eastern Alliance defeats the Western Alliance, and they are now under Kedorlaomer for 12 years. Now, a question arises. Why are they fighting this war? Why did the Eastern Alliance come all the way over from around the Persian Gulf to the Dead Sea? What's the purpose behind that? Well, it turns out they needed control of, or at least access to, the King's Highway. There is this major trade route that went from the Euphrates River down just north of the Sea of Galilee to the Syrian area, and then would go straight down to the Red Sea, and then straight west over into Egypt to Hierapolis. Now, Elam where cavalry armor was I'm going to mispronounce his name a whole lot. Here's a little tip. Just say the name confidently and nobody cares. Nobody knows how these names are pronounced. Just do the best you can. I'm going to mess them up. That's all right. All right, so Elam has trade with China. All right, there's a trade route that goes that way, and now they're trying to gain a trade route to the west in Egypt in order to enhance their power and their wealth. All right, what about the Western Alliance? Well, they are there to defend their homeland and also to retain free access to the King's Highway because they need to trade as well. And so in many wars, there's always differing reasons why people go into war. There's almost always a financial component to it. A lot of times it comes down to money. All right? Look at some of the wars that we fought. We liberated Iraq, and yet there was some oil considerations that we had there. I don't think that was the only consideration we had, but generally with war, there is some sort of financial thing that you're trying to protect or gain. And that's true here. And we don't read about that in the text of the Bible because that's not the point of the story here that the Bible gives us, the account. But looking into history and thinking, just trying to figure things out, why is this even happening? We can find out from history. Well, there's this major trade route that goes through there. And it had to be protected. It had to be controlled. And that's what this Eastern Alliance is trying to do. Now, how was this war fought? The weapons and the strategy. A very important verse is given to us before the flood ever happens. Lamech has 2 wives, and it talks about 3 of his sons. And the third one, the child born to Zillah, was Tubal-Cain. Notice how he is described. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. One of the things that I wondered about when looking at this text was, well, what kind of weapons would they have used? At this time in history, this is happening around 2000 BC, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little bit after, but that's a good round number for us to go off of. 2,000 years before Christ, 4,000 years from now. All right. Did they have swords and spears and things like that they could use? And they had those things before the flood. As soon as they learned how to do metallurgy, which is the forming of metal into different tools and objects, they could make a sword. In fact, that's one of the main things that these forgers did. And Tubal-Cain was one of those forgers of all instruments, tools, and weapons made of bronze and iron. A very important detail that's given to us about what kind of weapons would be used. And really, the weapons are not going to change that much from this time throughout the battles that we're going to look at. The style of the weapon might change some, and different cultures sort of had their own take on these different weapons. But they're not going to change that much. Look at this standard of Ur. This was taken from the royal tomb in Ur. Right, it dates back to around 2600 BC. Very interesting piece. It depicts there's a war side and a peace side. This is the war side. And the reason why we're looking at it right now is that it gives us a little bit of indication as to what type of weapons they would have used. One of the things I notice very importantly is chariots. Right? So at this time, they're already using chariots. And we'll look at that in just a moment and how they move those chariots. On the picture in the far bottom left, you see javelins coming up from the chariot. They would use those to throw. At this time, they would also have swords, and they would have archers, and they used battle axes. A close-up of one of these guys shows them carrying a battle axe. And they would also have a primitive form of armor. Let's look at some of these weapons a little more specifically. You have the chariot, drawn by donkeys. All right, so this is around 600 years before Abraham's battle here with the slaughter of the kings. Around that time, they were starting to use horses as well. But we'll go safe and say that they were still at this time carried by donkeys. But you see the javelins that they have there. One of the things that the Sumerians used was this sickle sword. The Sumerians refers to the people of that area, the Eastern Alliance. They would have a sword called the sickle sword. And then they would have javelins and spears that they would throw. Now, some of these weapons that are going to appear here are replicas of what was found in the royal tombs, where the standard of was found. And they're sort of the ceremonial golden-tipped versions of the weapons. And so the actual weapons would have been tipped with, iron and bronze and things like that. A little dagger, and then a battle axe. And they also had some armor. Now, this was a king's helmet made of gold. All right, it was more for show than anything else, but they would also wear sort of leather caps and animal skin armor. Didn't offer a lot of protection, but offered some. And so they would line up in these valleys and go at it. They also would have had archers and shields and things like that as well. I wasn't able to find a good picture of a shield from this era, but still, we get the idea. Now let's move on to phase 2 of this battle. In the 13th year, they, the Western Alliance, rebelled. In the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims and Ham, and the Emims and Sheva Kerethaim, and the Horites and their Mount Seir, unto Elparan, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to in Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. That's how we'll say it. Now, look at what happens here. They're coming to put down a rebellion, but that's not where they start. Phase 2 doesn't have anything to do with the Western Alliance directly. But the Eastern Alliance come and take this Ashtaroth and then go on to Ham and these different peoples who lived in these areas. So it talks about the Ashtaroth, Karnaim, the Rephaims who lived there, the Zuzims who lived in Ham, the Emims who lived in Sheva Kerethaim, going down to Mount Seir, where in the future it's going to be Edom, all the way down to Elparan, which is right there by the Red Sea, up to Kadesh. This is the place where they're going to Moses is going to send the spies into the Promised Land later on. All the country of the Amalekites, which is that general region, and then Hazazon Tamar. Now, so in phase 2, after the rebellion, the Eastern Alliance doesn't come back and just deal with the rebellion. They first go and take care of all these surrounding areas. Now, why all these areas? Well, what did we just talk about? There's a road that goes down that area all the way down to the Red Sea and then over into Egypt. And they want control of all of it. Control these trade routes. And so they take out everybody. Why they didn't do that before, I don't know, but they're doing it now. Now, phase 3. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, the same as Zoar. And they joined battle with them in the vale of Sidon, with Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. And the vale of Sidon was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and fell there. And they that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Verses 8 to 12. Let's look at how this happens. And so, the Western Alliance come down to the valley of Sidon, and the Eastern Alliance comes from the place they were, killing the Amorites there next to the Dead Sea. They come down to the valley of Sidon to fight. Well, it tells us what happens. Eastern Alliance wins. And the Western Alliance goes to flee back, the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fleeing back to their country, their cities. The problem is that area is full of what the Bible calls slime pits. What are these things? Well, these are tar pits, asphalt. All right, they would, there's petroleum underneath the ground. This type of petroleum seeps up through the ground and creates these pits. In fact, there's a really interesting video on YouTube. Great Discoveries, I think, is the channel name, but it's Genesis 14 v 10. And they went to this area, and there are still these tar pits there. And some of them are covered up by a thin layer of shale, but there's a warning sign that if you step on them, you'll fall right through. And some of them are shallow, and some of them are very deep. And so that's what happened to these kings way back 4,000 years ago. They fell into one of these slime pits, one of these tar pits, because they were fleeing so fast away from the battle, and they died there. The rest of them went up the mountain. But Lot is there, still in the city of Sodom. And the Eastern Alliance, these kings go and they take him. They spoil Sodom. And they're going, now what is Lot even doing there? Well, let's look back at verse 10 and following of chapter 13. Abraham gave him the opportunity to choose his land. There were fights between Lot's men and Abram's men, and Abram gave him the opportunity. You choose, and I'll go the other direction. Of course, Lot lifted up his eyes and looked at the plain of Jordan. And this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. But it was very fertile, very great land, and so he goes over there to live. But notice verse 13. The men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. You see, neither of these two alliances are worthy of our being on their side. You know, when we see war or watch sports or anything like that where two sides are fighting each other or playing against each other, you want to pick a side. Well, there's no good side here. Sodom and all of those cities of the plain were exceedingly wicked, but so were the heathen people of the Eastern Alliance. So who are you going to root for? Well, there's nobody to root for. But Lot was mixed up with the Western Alliance. He was mixed up in Sodom. And he was taken because of it. And after they take all the things from Sodom and Lot, Eastern Alliance are headed back home. All right, they're going back up, and they're on the King's Highway. They're gonna shoot over to the Euphrates River and go back to the land wealthier and having been successful. You see, the Eastern Alliance was very powerful. In fact, these are the folks who invented professional warfare. They were wealthy enough in their fertile land that the farmers would continue to work in farming, and then they would have people, because they had so much excess, that were professional warriors. The Western Alliance was no match for the Eastern Alliance, and that's why they won both times. And it seems that they won fairly easily. And so the Eastern Alliance are headed back home, successful and happy, and everything is great until phase 4. There came one that had escaped, and he escaped from Sodom, and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And so we see the third alliance, the Abram alliance. Living in the plain of Mamre, which is on the west side of the Dead Sea, around what's going to be Hebron. And he has some friends. Abram made friends with the people he lived around. Mamre, Eshcol, Aner. These men are going to go fight with Abram. Let's look at what happens. When Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. They go to fight. He takes his 318 trained servants. He gives them weapons, most likely swords and battle axes and things like that. And they take off toward Dan. And they overtake the Eastern Alliance. And Abram is not looking for a valley here to line up, because Abram's forces would have been no match for the Eastern Alliance in the Vale of Sodom or any other valley where they would just line up and fight. Abram's smarter than that. Instead, he divides himself against them, he and his servants. He surrounds them, not in the middle of the day in a fair fight. He surrounds them at night and attacks them in order to rescue Lot. They fight in Dan at night, and then Eastern Alliance goes up to Hobah, which is on the left side of Damascus, the capital of Syria. And Abram goes there and fights and defeats the Eastern Alliance. And then he brings back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the people. Now is the return. This is where most of your Bible studies have picked up. Abraham is coming back from the slaughter of the kings, and he's going back home. And two men meet him there. And these two men could not be any more different. The king of Sodom, verse 17, went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him at the valley of Shevi, which is the king's dale. It's thought that this valley is just north of Jerusalem. And so Abraham comes down on the west side of Jerusalem, west side of the Jordan River, instead of the right side, the eastern side of the Jordan River. So he's not going back down to Sodom. He's going back home, and has apparently this arrangement with the king of Sodom that he comes out to meet. Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. So you have the king of Sodom, an exceedingly wicked, evil man. And then you have this man of God, Melchizedek, a character that's shrouded in mystery, that's brought up again in Psalms, and then also in the book of Hebrews, as being a type of Christ, that Jesus' priesthood is going to be after the order of Melchizedek, because Melchizedek is king and priest and is before the Levite priesthood. We're not going to go into all of that. I encourage you to study Hebrews 5 through 7, especially chapter 7, about Melchizedek. But he comes out, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And the Hebrews writer makes a point of this, that Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. The less is blessed of the better. But notice how the king, priest, Melchizedek gives credit for this victory to God. It was God which delivered Abram's enemies into his hand. Then Abraham gave tithes of all. So you have this Melchizedek who comes out to meet Abraham. And then you have the king of Sodom. And what a different man the king of Sodom was. And the conversation between Abram and the king of Sodom goes much differently. The king has an offer. Give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, made a promise. Right, he lifted up his hand, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abram rich. Abram got into this war, this battle, for Lot, not to gain wealth. And so he's not going to take anything from Sodom, save only that which the young men have eaten. They deserve to eat, his trained servants. They ate of the spoil. They deserve to do that. And the portion of the men which went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, they were able to take their portion of things. But Abraham would not, because he didn't want Sodom, the king of Sodom, to take credit for his wealth. He was blessed by God. Now, keys to victory. In each of these studies, we're going to learn some lessons about the battle that help us in our battle against Satan. And there are some good ones here. One, pick your battles. Some battles are not worth fighting. In fact, I think some battles are put before us by Satan to tempt us, to distract us from the battles we ought to be fighting. If you're on Facebook, you go through the timeline and you see over and over again battles that you shouldn't be involved in. Stay out of them. Abram didn't pick this battle. He could have gotten involved in the first phase, but he didn't. He could have gotten involved in the second phase, but he didn't. It was only when he had a dog in that fight, Lot was taken, that he sprang into action to fight this battle. So pick your battles wisely. Another lesson is to fight for the right reasons. Fight for the right reasons. He wasn't fighting to gain wealth or power or prestige or a good reputation among the people around him. He was fighting because it was right. Because here is a guy who couldn't fight for himself, Lot, who was kidnapped, someone that Abraham loved, and he went and rescued him. We ought to remember to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. When you're at school, there's the kid who's always bullied. There's one at your school. You need to fight for him. Not necessarily get into a physical fight, but you need to stand up for that kid. Not being worried about whether or not you're considered to be cool. You surround the people who struggle to fight for themselves, and you help them. That's what Abram did. Also, create good alliances. Why did these three brothers join this fight? They didn't have a dog in it, but they respected Abram. That tells us a little bit about how Abram lived his life. That these others would so willingly join the battle against, outnumbered, against a fighting force. And yet they joined in, traveled all the way up there, and they were rewarded as a result. And then make decisions based on long-term spiritual victory. This is what Lot didn't do. This is what Lot teaches us. Lot looked up and chose the most fertile place. It looked good from across the river. But he got over there, and as a result, he got kidnapped. And after he got kidnapped, where'd he go? He went right back to Sodom. Imagine that. Right back to Sodom. Until in Genesis 19, 5 chapters later, Sodom is destroyed. And Lot once again had to flee. Now, Lot was a righteous man. The New Testament tells us that he was. But here, he goes back to an evil place. In fact, we're told in the New Testament that it vexed his soul living around those people, but he continued to do so until God came to destroy them. He didn't make decisions based on long-term spiritual victory, but what was in front of his eyes at that moment. We need to think more long-term than that. At the end of each of these studies, I want to add a section about a personal reflection. And the personal reflection I have for this time are these two words. I wonder. Whenever you are reading through the Bible, this phrase should come to your mind over and over and over again. And don't turn your back on it. Don't neglect it. See, too many times we read the Bible and we simply read to get from A to B. I'm supposed to read 3 chapters a day in order to read the Bible in a year. So I'll read these 3 chapters. I read them as fast as I can. I get it over with, and then I go on about my day. And I never learn anything about the Bible. As you read through, I wonder who these people are. Kedorlaomer and these other kings? Where do they really come from? Where is Shinar, Elam? Why are they fighting against these people? I wonder what type of weapons they used. I wonder when these things happen. I wonder what's going on in the rest of the world while these things are happening. Always wonder. And then seek to find out the answers to your questions. And when you do that, the Bible will come alive for you. When you allow yourselves to wonder about it and then search out the answers if they can be found. Some questions can't be found. Many questions can if we're willing to dig under the surface and look. I so much appreciate your going through this study with me. I hope you have enjoyed it as I have. And we'll come out with another one, hopefully within a week or two. But until we see each other again, keep fighting the good fight.